quite obvious. And at that point, David and myself made another decision that seemed reasonable under the circumstances, and that is if we were, for whatever reason, whether it was incompetence, whether it was deliberate, no one necessarily will ever know that. But the fact is the results given to us were false and were not adequate. A decision was made to then forward this material directly to the Environmental Protection Agency administered by Carol Ann Browner. And that was done by certified mail. And Carol Ann Browner does have possession of a finite sample of the material that we are speaking of. This was done in January of this year in 2000. And unfortunately, that office, the Environmental Protection Office, has refused, number one, to acknowledge the existence of the sample, which was included within this letter, has replied with a letter explaining the formation of conventional contrails, and repeatedly states that they are unaware, they repeatedly use the word, they are unaware of any program to distribute materials over the population through aircraft. And unfortunately, the determination is made by myself and Dave that their response at this stage constitutes negligence in their duties. They have been in possession of this material for over 6 months now and maintain their position that there is nothing new and that there is no acknowledgement even of this material which has been sent to them. What is especially incredible also is that during this 6-month period in which she has had custody of a sample of this material, I have had the opportunity to view this material under a very high quality microscope, something that I don't normally have access to myself. And I was a witness to these events. They are recorded on videotape, and it is a microscope session. There are actually 2 sessions under the microscope. And the unfortunate fact and truth is that within these 2 samples, both evaluated independently, that there are biological components that have been identified within these samples. And these biological components are composed of, to the best of the ability of the individual, professional individual operating this microscope, are blood cells, are red blood cells, by his identification, human blood cells, and white blood cells, and numerous other cells of unknown type that are in here. What is of further interest in these components is that these cells were not immediately visible, even under a professional microscope, except under unusual conditions. These conditions involve the use of an immersion oil, which is a certain type of oil used in microscopy. By all indications, these cells that have been identified are of a freeze-dried or desiccated nature. They apparently are dry and would not be visible unless you knew what you were looking for, except in maybe extreme skills, that someone might have in terms of knowing that something there and is looking for it. And it's only under a particular combination of use of this particular oil, he tried other oils and it didn't work, this particular oil caused these cells to, in a sense, hydrate, even though it's not necessarily water-based, and rejuvenate themselves to where they are visible clearly under the microscope. They appear both individually as well as in clusters. The fact is that these are there, and they bring a greater sense of urgency for Carol M. Browner of the Environmental Protection Agency to adequately identify this material. And it's simply a reasonable request and a reasonable obligation for her to provide that identification under the circumstances. And to this date, that has not been provided.
Once you accept that chemtrails are not contrails, the realization sinks in that the Earth and its inhabitants are being subjected to unprecedented experimentation without our knowledge or permission. In the face of official denials that anything suspicious is going on, the internet and radio airwaves are rife with anxious speculation. Some say the chemtrails are intended to kill us all. Other observers insist that the disorientation and lethargy resulting from chemtrail exposure is intended to make citizens compliant to the New World Order and enslave us all. Based on the evidence presented in this video, the producers believe that the most plausible explanation for this massive aerial spraying is a planet-wide, high-tech campaign against catastrophic climate change. If this is true, such a desperate Band-Aid solution disregards the fundamental causes of global warming in order to protect powerful financial interests by permitting pollution and profits as usual. It has been the experience of all who have reported chemtrail activity that federal, state, and provincial governments refuse to acknowledge chemtrails. Though denials come from every level, authorities responsible for public health, safety, and the environment say they will act when forced by the public to do so. If public pressure is the key, then the most effective action is to alert people to what is taking place right over their heads. Take this tape or your own footage and chemtrail photos to your local television stations. Remember, cable producers are required to broadcast local content as public service announcements. Don't be afraid to speak out. You'll be surprised how many people are noticing the unusual proliferation of jet trails but don't know what they're seeing. When enough people learn that these puzzling plumes are really chemtrails, and that we are being sprayed with unknown substances without our informed consent, the message will spread, and our leaders will be compelled to respond to the concerns of citizens who have seen for themselves the mystery lines in the sky.
Maybe you could give us a sense of the implications of this. We're talking about human blood material prepared in a certain way, dried and put into a spray and sprayed over us. I mean, aren't we talking about biological warfare here?
Unfortunately, the implications are rather of a serious nature, we could say, to say the least. That is why that duty is so strong on her side and needs to be urged by all citizens to simply get the straight story as to what it is. It's not necessarily productive for me to speculate. I'm not a microbiologist by trade. I'm not a genetic engineer by trade. But there certainly is sufficient cause to warrant an investigation as to what is this material composed of and why are such biological components residing there. It is also not to say that this material is necessarily either representative or even exhaustive of those materials which are being observed. It's simply a case, two cases that remain unanswered, and the implications of what has been found with the study of them is rather ominous and foreboding, at least potentially.
I've heard a mention of aluminum type of particles. Have you had any information on that, any research on that?
I have heard suggestions, we could say, of such particles. But until I'm able to see them or have them identified,